What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you 5 games that really deserved a sequel. Now that said, most of the games on this list are quite probably never going to get a sequel, but nonetheless I thought it would be fun to talk about 5 games in particular that I really wish would get a sequel, even if that is incredibly unlikely. So first and foremost, a game I played recently, and actually mentioned in my video about it, and that is Arcanum of Steamworks and Magic Obscura. Now, while Arcanum itself is a very flawed game from Troika Games that came out all the way back in 2001, the story and the world of Arcanum are just really interesting. They tackled a lot of issues. It's sort of this industrial steampunk thing meets high fantasy, and overall it was something that they pulled off incredibly well, especially given the time, which is why you'll often see Arcanum highly praised in the things it did. But nonetheless, these days, Arcanum is basically an IP on ice, and while it is technically owned by Activision, I would hardly expect a sequel or a reboot or anything of that fashion basically ever. Now, next up, we have Vampire. Now, of every video game on this list, this one is probably the most likely to eventually get a sequel. So, Vampire was a very well-received and successful vampire RPG that came out, where you took on the role of a doctor who had recently been turned into a vampire in the city of London during a sort of blood plague that is going on, so he's uniquely equipped to deal with that situation. And while it's very hard to sum up Vampire and everything it does well in just a couple sentences here, it is definitely one of those games that is remarkable and really worth trying out. Now, third on the list, we have Tyranny. Tyranny is Obsidian's lesser-known CRPG. Now, everyone is pretty well aware of the Pillars of Eternity series, however, Obsidian did actually make another CRPG known as Tyranny. Now, unfortunately, it did not sell particularly well, or at least it missed targets, so to speak, but Tyranny takes place in a world where evil kind of won, and you can either go with that or fight back, and there's 4 or 5 different ways to go through the actual story, and probably worst of all when it comes to Tyranny is that they left it on a huge cliffhanger of sorts, depending on exactly which ending you go with, but more often than not, Tyranny ends on this big cliffhanger. And unfortunately, because of sales being what they are and everything, it is unlikely Tyranny will ever see a sequel. Though it is technically possible, I really wouldn't hold my breath about it. So unfortunately, we'll probably never know, outside of our own headcanon, exactly how that story ended. Fourth on the list, continuing our Obsidian trend, is the third Pillars of Eternity. So Pillars of Eternity is popular. I've personally covered it a ton. I don't have too much more to add here outside of it is a very well done and mostly well received CRPG series set in the very cool world of Eora, which will be the setting for the upcoming Avowed whenever that eventually releases. But Pillars of Eternity, much in the same vein of Tyranny, actually ended on this kind of huge cliffhanger with very much so world-impacting things up in the air that, in theory, a sequel would have potentially dealt with. Now, it is very much so rumored that Avowed is actually a prequel to both of the Pillars of Eternities. So while it is certainly possible for Avowed to handle this, we just don't know for sure if it will. But nonetheless, Avowed is a bit of a genre shift from the other 2 Pillars of Eternities, going first person, so we'll have to see how that plays out. But for someone who loves CRPGs like myself, it feels sad to say that we are unlikely to ever see Pillars of Eternity 3. And then last on the list, we have Kingdoms of Amalur Reckoning. So while I've reviewed Kingdoms of Amalur, the remaster specifically, Re-Reckoning, and I do have some faults with the game, I nonetheless think it was a lot of fun, and I think the best thing they could do, if possible, that is to say THQ Nordic, who now owns the IP, would be to just do a sequel if the interest is there. Now, unfortunately, I don't know that the interest is there to actually sell a sequel, though most of the people who have played Kingdoms of Amalur are very much so in favor of it. And while I personally wasn't quite as blown away as a lot of people were, nonetheless, I do think Kingdoms of Amalur is a very good game with a lot of cool concepts that I would like expanded upon, and unfortunately, due to the nature of its release and everything that was going on with the studio that made it at the time, it just never really got a fair shot at success, in my opinion. So it would be really cool to see a sequel to that game at some point. But there you go, guys. 5 games that I truly believe deserve a sequel, even if we probably never will see it. So that said, thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. In the meantime, may you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.